Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host, and I'm also the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to highlight relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts and practitioners. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Bob Treadway, who is globally praised consulting futurist, strategy advisor, and leadership educator. For the past 33 years, he's helped organizations and leaders look ahead, plan flexibly, and take action on the future. Clients like Gillette, Berkshire Hathaway, ExxonMobil, Hilton, the Federal Reserve and AT&T, to name but a few, use his services to help them understand uncertainty, anticipate coming events, make better decisions, and develop robust strategic plans. And that's going to be the topic of today with Bob, especially with all that uncertainty in today's current environment. But before we jump in, Bob has a very eclectic background, and I wanted to highlight some of his former jobs and get more insight into how he navigated this very diverse career path, which includes an engineer for bridges, broadcaster, college professor, business broker, and strategy consultant. Welcome, Bob, and thank you for joining me today. And I'd love to gain some insight because that's a lot and a very diverse mix of different professions.
Early in life, I had trouble hanging on to a job. Might be one way to look at it. But truly, the market has kind of taken me in various directions, and I've looked at several ways to kind of fulfill my wishes on what I wanted to do as a professional. And that's what kind of led to the succession of things that I did. There were also a couple of incidents, kind of trigger events, as all of us should be looking for in my life. One of them was getting drafted into the Army during the Vietnam War. I'm old enough to have done that, which changed my career path from engineering into broadcasting. And then some things that my clients did when I was consulting to broadcasting clients after I left it took me out into a wider world, which led to the work that I've been doing, as you said, for the last 33 or so years. So, I think you got to roll with the punches and take the advantages as they come.
Well, I love that, and I'm sure that's offered you some great insight into your current career in having that diverse background. And I'm asked by a lot of our leaders and our members to say, how can I stay better informed of this hyper busy work environment with so much uncertainty? And from our past conversations, you've enlightened me into some curated news sources, which I love. And the two that I really look at every day are that Morning Brew and Next Draft. So perhaps you can give our listeners a little more information on those two. And are there other ones that you would recommend as well?
I collect these, and I think right now on my website, there's a list of about 7 or 8, and it kind of varies as to what it is your background is or what it is that your curiosities are. And these have been sort of, although I'm on the lookout for them, many of them have been given to me by either people in settings that I've been in or strategy meetings or IMS sessions. You mentioned a couple, Morning Brew, which is and all of these are free. Morning Brew is a free newsletter that comes out daily that kind of informs you of what's going on in the world of work, in the world of business in many cases. I like it a lot, and you can go find it by just putting in morningbrew.com into your browser. You also mentioned one that's a little unusual, kind of quirky and offbeat. It's Next Draft, all one word, .com. There's a venture capitalist in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, named Dave Pell, who had started doing this for free years ago. I think he's now on his at least I think I've been a subscriber for 6 or 7 years at least. And he kind of develops a top 10 from the internet. He's nicknamed the editor of the internet, and he'll show you some things that you would have missed, and they're compressed into an email that comes to you, so you can click on the links and go further into the stories. And that's what many of these suggestions are that I've passed along. They're pragmatic approaches to saving you time and allowing you to see some things that are out of your normal scope of vision. And that's the objective. I'd say one more that I recommend that I think is probably my top vote getter when I sort of survey people as to what they found useful, and that is Quartz, QZ.com or QZ.com if you're up in Canada. It's a free daily newsletter, but it has capacities beyond that. Many of these organizations have expanded out into even deeper information sources. But those three, I think, are three top ones that I would suggest to everyone. And what you want to do is not change your habits, but you might want to say, hey, can I devote 10 minutes a day to making myself better informed by choosing just one of these? And as you know, many of the participants that we've had in IMS sessions have found that one of the first things that they want to commit to as they return to their workplace.
Well, and you're right. I mean, there's so many different news sources out there, and this really saves you time. It gets reliable, accurate data, news, depending on the one that you choose. So that really cuts down the time. The other thing that I found to be helpful too is that I just recently subscribed to pocket.com. And that's a way then to save these articles into one source, right? So that you can have them all in one repository in your account. It's a free account. And that's been a huge time savings as well, because there's always something that I want to send to someone, post somewhere, and that allows me to just put everything into that one source and then curate it from.
And here's what people like me do. They hear something like that, and I'm a user of Pocket myself, and think, that's something I had to mention in the seminar. So, I appreciate mixing with people and being kind of a repository or a channel to pass these suggestions along to people who want to be better informed and who want to be looking ahead, which is the whole crux of what it is that I do with the Institute.
Well, and kind of extending that crux, I mean, let's go through some of these forecasting techniques that you found to be effective throughout your 3.5 decades in the industry. And I'd like to just touch upon some of the bigger categories. And then if you could provide an example of each one, because I love the first one, let's first talk about the Harbinger zones. And Harbinger zones are those bellwethers, early adopters, leading edges, or precursors. You have an interesting origin story for bellwether, which I always remember. But then, tell me about how we can use those to then predict something meaningful going on right now.
Bellwether is an ancient term developed back in the medieval ages, and it refers to the practice of hanging a bell on a castrated male sheep in a sheep herd. And shepherds used that bell to be able to hear where the herd is going, to be able to locate them, and to see what direction they're moving in. So it's used today as a term to kind of identify those areas that are ahead of others. So for instance, we find that technology adoption might take place in a younger age group than it would in an older, for instance, or certain fields have cutting edge aspects to them like artificial intelligence or genetics or robotics and those kinds of things. I came across in my scanning a unique example just in the last few days. One of the newer sources I've been using is called The Hustle, and they have come up with they've identified something that developed through research in the last 5 years called harbingers of failure. And what these are customers on product tests that have adopted all of the wrong choices. They've been really bad at forecasting, and it's great information. For instance, here are some of the products that they have really glommed onto over the last decade or so. Crystal Pepsi, which you've never heard of, very probably, watermelon Oreo, Frito-Lay lemonade, and one of my favorites are the Colgate kitchen entrees, like Colgate lasagna. Don't those sound like great products to you? That's one of my favorites. Or Cheetos lip balm. And they've been able to identify these people by demographics and location. There are certain zip codes that are full of harbingers of doom. And these give you the idea of what it is that you don't want to do. Kind of an interesting sort of a forecast. So
yeah, that's quite entertaining and interesting because you learn a lot more about failures than you do with your successes. But it's interesting to see that all those products came at least into a beta form of development, right? And
right.
Someone thought at some point they must have been in demand or going to be somewhat successful. I would I would question that motive now, but hindsight's always 2020, I guess.
Yeah, and so yeah, there's kind of a reverse psychology there that certain products don't do well in some of those areas. But the information that is surprising is oftentimes even more interesting than those that identify necessarily the slam dunk successes.
Right.
Surprising.
Well, let's move into the next one, those micro indicators. And those
Yeah.
are those small pieces that move with the whole system or network. And I love the example that you use that a grocery indicator is egg sales in Indonesia. So if you could go into that in more detail.
Yeah, I'll correct that. In the visual you're looking at it, there were two different things. The grocery indicator is something that a CFO of a fairly large grocery chain told me was that he could predict the gross margin and with accuracy in any of his stores, whether it was going up or going down in any economy based on the sales of one brand name product.
Now I got it. Yep. Charmin, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was Charmin tissue, which was the indicator in bad times or stressful times. And of course, we've had a
That played out very well in the COVID pandemic.
the egg sales in Indonesia was something I got from a question that I love to ask leaders, which who've been running large organizations, which is what is your metric? What is the thing that you watch that gives you a leg up and a forecast of something that's coming? And I asked it of the CEO at the time of one of the largest grain companies in the world and one of the largest closely held companies here in the United States. And he said, egg sales in Indonesia. He said it gives him an overall look at where grain sales are going globally. And the reason is that Indonesia is the largest by population Muslim population, and their primary grain source is chickens and eggs. And the government there tracks that statistic very carefully. And he's been able to track that way. I'll give you another one that, will ring true for people as they hear news in these days, and that is sewage analysis in American cities for two things: COVID presence and opioids. That's been going on for the last several years, and it gives us an indication of where cases are rising and falling in the United States, and also opioid use to be able to identify where mitigation efforts have actually been successful.
That's interesting. I didn't even know that anyone was examining that. So it's
Yeah.
good to know. So let's move then to the upstream looks. And these are 2 to 3 steps up in the timeline, right? The cause and effect timeline that will give us some indication. You have a great example with the Powell Street BART station on how to do it. But if there's another example that would connect or resonate, or the construction example that you used.
Yeah, I think the one regarding the revenue for the city of San Francisco, the system here in California does not allow many municipalities to see what their revenues are going to be because they're mostly based on sales tax revenue, which is collected by the merchant, forwarded to the capital in Sacramento, and then it may be months before that information and those funds actually return to the city. Makes it extremely difficult to budget. And the chief economist of the city began to think about that in conjunction with some of his team members. And they said, well, how can we get an idea of what the sales taxes collections would be? And the merchants won't share that information, but they used kind of a workaround. They went to the BART station, the light rail station that's closest to the biggest shopping district in the city of San Francisco, and then looked at their Saturday turnstile numbers and compared those to what the revenues were coming back from Sacramento on an adjusted time frame. And they were able to develop this algorithm in order to be able to determine in advance what their revenues would be. There's a lot of things that you can understand by looking upstream. For instance, I often ask in a quiz with participants in education sessions, how would you determine, whether or not construction is going to take place a year in advance? And there's a lot of factors there, but one of them is looking at the development of construction plans out of the architecture industry. There's a lot of things that you can see if you look at where they're coming from before they arrive.
That's great with that upstream look, but how about those signals that are hiding in plain sight? How are we better able to identify those that may be misunderstood or overlooked or even ignored?
Yeah, I've been doing this for a long time now and with a lot of different clients. A lot of things that are in the news, sometimes we fail to recognize what the after effects are going to be, what the implications are going to be. But there's also an awful lot of things that are just kind of there that some people who are thinking analytically about them can identify. And I'll tell you a story goes back a long time, over 20 years in my practice. I was doing a board briefing for a large telecommunications company. At the time, I was working a lot in that industry. And one of the things that I presented the board with was a bit of a boilerplate on how to look into the future. And one of the tools I showed them was something I use in IMS sessions called the cone of relative certainty. And it says that, hey, let's stand here in the present, look out into the future, and look at the range of uncertainty as it moves out there. Does it get narrower or does it get wider? And it obviously gets wider. And I got that out of my mouth, and one of the directors of that organization stopped me. And I mean, he literally almost yelled at me, "Stop." And he said, "I have never seen it presented like that before." He said, "Tell me something." He said, "You're somebody who does forecasting." He said, "Take that cone that you're talking about and tell us three things that are going to affect this company in a positive way in the next 5 years, three things that will affect us negatively in the next 5 years that you think that we're not thinking about right now." So here's where, as a consultant, you're on the spot.
There you are. Yeah.
And I said, and so I'm not going to bore you with the positive things. They had some good product development issues and things like that that they were working with. But when it came to the negative, I said, the first thing you've got to realize is that things can affect your system, and they were operating primarily in the Carolinas, don't take place anywhere near you because we are much more interconnected these days. And I gave some examples. I said, weather events. I said there was an ice storm in the Northeast last winter. It took down the financial service systems that support ATMs, so you couldn't get cash out of a machine in San Francisco because of all the ice that was in New York State. I said there are things like that that are weather events or could be geopolitical events or things along those lines. And these guys who had the board and the senior management in the room just went berserk for a bit and talked about all of the potentials. And their nightmare scenario was that something would affect their provider of cellular phone service. This is over 20 years ago. And they were getting it primarily from what became Verizon Wireless at the time. They said, hey, if a dirty bomb floats into New York Harbor and goes off, we're out of luck. We don't have backups, workarounds, insurance. And they talked about that on mid-August 2001 in North Carolina. And on September 11th or September 12th it was of that year, I got an email because the phones still weren't working real well from the CEO saying, how did you predict that? So he was talking about 9/11, of course, and I wrote him back and I said, I didn't predict anything. I said there was a 75% chance in the next 5 years that this could happen and you should be preparing for it, and asked him how the system had gone. And they had done some things. They had backups. Their wireless system for their phone company did not go down. So there's an example. Those signals were hiding there in plain sight, and examples of them, like I just mentioned.
No, that's great. And it's nice to have these tools now, right? That everyone can use. And if you know where to look, then you can provide these insights to your organization as well. So like what they did, I'd like to put you on the spot just a little bit and talk about a COVID forecast and where you think things are going now, right? Because starting this year, it accelerated again with the new Omicron variant.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stress, burnout, exhaustion by individuals saying we're 2 years now or almost 2 years into it.
Mm-hmm.
When is this going to end? How do you think it's going to impact my life, my business, how I work? And really what I'm seeing a lot with organizations is hybrid work and really how this is going to affect hybrid work in the next, let's say 2 to 3 years.
So a couple of things. First of all, on forecast, and I'm glad you're using that term because the thing I often start out working with clients on is to tell them not to predict. The prediction is really foolish. And now you're hearing it from some of the pundits as we talk about COVID. And I prefer forecast, and my definition is looking into the future with uncertainty taken into account, meaning that you talk about potential events in terms of percentages or odds or those kinds of issues. And that a forecast is only a point in time, that it changes with the furtherance of time and when you get new information. So I do forecasts, and I try to forecast in ranges, and I'm not going to pop up a visual here, but I started making forecasts for clients on COVID back in about late July and August of 2020. And one of the things that I tried to show them was that what are all of the factors that are going to go into this, including, you just named many of them, resurgence. And we talked about variants right up front in those days. And my timeline for returning to a substantial degree of normalcy was out in 2022. And people thought I was crazy. This is going to be over in 6 months. But now we've learned through two variants that have really set things back. And now we're looking at the variants of Omicron, which we've had right now, et cetera. So there's a great deal of uncertainty. How do you do that? Well, how do you forecast that? You look at potentials, et cetera, and you look at the things that you can count on. And you just named one, Charles. Hybrid work looks like it's going to stay with us post-pandemic. In other words, the ability to be able to communicate like you and I are now on this platform, as well as the ability to be able to be face-to-face. And companies thought they were going to be able to get people back into buildings, back into office space early on. Now they've set that back, and now we're in sort of this morass of uncertainty. But there's one thing that I'll hang my hat on, and that is I'm 95% certain that hybrid work survives beyond this. And part of it is signals that have been hiding in plain sight. There's been a desire to do this for maybe decades. I can remember doing internal work with the Social Security Administration, and one of the biggest internal issues was the inability to do distance work. There were certain categories within the organization that allowed that, but there's deep resentment from an awful lot of employees who weren't able to do that, despite the fact that their jobs would permit that to a certain extent, or certainly through security means. So a lot of these things are going to be there for a while. Now, the forecast that I was developing back in August of 20, I was saying March of 22 or later. And it looks like we're there. I don't know if we're going to be back to normal. My wife and I would love to travel again, but right now it is just difficult as the dickens to go outside of the U.S. borders, for instance. And organizations are finding that an interesting new development on the issue of hybrid work is that if people can work offline remote, or work, I should say, online remote, they have a certain level of stress. The least amount of stress among employees is in the example of those who can actually go back into the office now. But those who are doing hybrid work are some of the most stressed and exhausted that we've found anywhere in the workplace in America. You may be familiar with that situation. So there's what I'm saying. I'm saying, hey, later.
Well, March 2022, I mean, if you turn out to be right, I think you're going to give Nostradamus for smart. Your forecasting technique, profound. And I like how you stated too, right, with a forecast, because there's another educator that we've had on the podcast that said you don't predict the future, manage the uncertainty, right? So getting out of this mindset of I need to predict it, because it's impossible to do so. And the forecasting is only good as what you put into it and the quality, so you don't have the garbage in, garbage out type of effects. I love one of the quotes that I know you've put in your sessions is that, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. And I feel like everyone's been through those weeks more than those decades, right? Where nothing happens. I mean, the weeks have just strung along here, and I'm sure everyone's hoping to get some relief in sight. So that's what we're going to hope for. So I love to, before we end today's program, I love to kind of talk about one of those tools. for understanding the impact a decision has and the implications or after effects it has on making that decision. And you can do this with a whole host of different decisions that you make just to get clear on those implications.
Yeah.
And the exercise that you normally do is you take a central issue, you have three distinct independent implications. You identify the central issue first, and then you say, and then what happens?
Yeah.
And then you build it out for as long as you can do it with some certainty. And so correct me if I'm wrong, if that's kind of the setup for it. And if that is, I'd love to work through just a quick example to give our listeners how this plays out with an issue that's should be front and center on more people's minds.
Yep. Implication thinking is what I call it. And in the examples, in the situations we have in the IMS educational events, I like to start with, a central question, issue, scenario, problem, etc.
So why don't we pick the issue of American birth rates that fell for the sixth consecutive year in 2020 to their lowest number since 1979.
Yeah.
And this is not just a US picture, but this is really a global picture because the national picture mirrors the decline in births that have been seen worldwide. And some trend experts say that it's been accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic.
Yep.
Now, the majority of articles, what they try to identify is reasons behind, not implications because of it. And some of the reasons behind the drop that I've seen and I've kind of jotted down are it's closely related to that women are becoming a larger factor in the labor market, right? They're having their families starting later in life, delaying marriage, delaying having babies, which, from the first birth is 27 is the average right now. Back in 2010, the average age of their first child was 23. So this changing picture of motherhood has driven part of it. Also, birth rates for teenagers have drastically declined, which is in probably most cases seen as a positive.
Yeah.
And then how does COVID play into it, right? I mean,
You want to go to a hospital?
Yeah.
You want to go visit a hospital these days?
Exactly.
I was talking to one of my neighbors yesterday, and he's been suffering from a hernia. And he said, I need to have it repaired, cleared to have it repaired, but I can't get in for maybe another 2 years because of the backlog of cases. So there you go.
The canceling of elective surgeries is one implication of COVID, right? I mean, it's hitting the healthcare system, but let's focus on this declining in births. What are the kind of the implications that result from this fact, which we've seen this pattern happen? I mean, one I would argue is retirement and Social Security benefits are going to be reduced, right? So the retirement's going to be hit in the US. Looking at the US here, not necessarily looking at it from a global perspective. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you may be jumping over a couple of steps there. Well, one of the things that if we're going to have fewer people born in America and we don't have immigration to make up for that many countries use and find necessary, then we're going to have a smaller population. And with a smaller population, there's fewer people in the workforce. And with fewer people in the workforce, then they're not going to pay, as much in tax. So what you just mentioned was maybe even a third level, but
you're right, because that Social Security is that pay-as-you-go system, right? Fewer births result in fewer future workers.
Right. Yeah,
contribute into the system, and consequently can result in an everyone penalty, right? Where we're all going to be impacted by that if figures play out.
And when you do these first level implications like we're doing right here, you want to make them distinct from each other. So let me just say one that occurred to me because I had some experience working with a particular profession last year. There's going to be less need for OBGYN, those doctors, right? So if there's less need for OBGYNs, then you say, well, maybe there's a couple of implications from that. And, they turn to emphasize the GYN portion of their practice, those where they're dealing with women's reproductive health, for instance. And, if there's less need for OBGYNs, I mean, you've got some familiarity. What else do you think would result from that?
Well, you're right. I mean, with, the medical profession being strapped and, doctors now are in short supply, but, that might cause just a transition or a move into different sectors of the healthcare industry, since they're not really seeing the demand in this one area, and this really speaks to, the shortage of workers, right? I mean, that's a direct result. And maybe a second implication on that shortage of workers could mean you're pushing up wages, right? And
You could-
causing wage inflation.
Yeah, you could be. You could also look at, if you stay with that profession, you could also say that, maybe there's going to be retraining. Some of those individuals might retrain out, or they might go to, be able to bolster the things that are happening in healthcare overall and fill in for some of those shortages of docs in other areas, or take on traveling jobs and things like that. And then if we think about the U.S. birth rates are down, think about the effect on education. So in 5 years, right, because this has been declining for some period of time, in 5 years, it's going to have a deep effect on kindergarten and elementary school attendance. And as you point out, since this has been going on for some period of time, I'll tell you what's going on in tertiary education, in universities and colleges. They're looking at something, they now call it the cliff. Within the next 5 years, the enrollment, the available high school graduating classes are going to be as much as 25% smaller than they are today. And they call that the cliff, the drop off of those enrollments, which means that there's more competition. So if you're a Harvard or a Yale or, Columbia, you're going to get your enrollment. But if you're Iowa State or Cal State Fresno or something along those lines, you're going to have to compete in a much different way. And there's all of the implications of that. So,
Well, and they're seeing that right now with COVID, right? Because a lot of these land grant institutions have built out their universities and they have that assumption built in that people are going to want, that students are coming in and doing live in person. And over the last year and a half, I've seen it firsthand where a lot of these universities are having to think their practices right and different revenue models because students aren't coming in to stay in dorms. They're doing more virtual programs, virtual sessions, or even getting virtual online degrees. And how is that going to change the face of education, which could be a whole nother central issue, right? With how this is going to be impacted
right.
moving forward.
And it's one thing for purely academic, and I mean, really almost, those kinds of things that can be done online. But if you get into a school, as you know, I've got some familiarity with agriculture since I work a lot in that sector. You're a school of agriculture and you're trying to turn out students and you're not letting them hands on with pigs and cows and, and poultry, you can't graduate an educated individual. So.
Well, you're right. When it's a skill gap, you got to be in there. You got to be doing it hands on. And that's going to be very difficult. And I think, I'm looking forward to see what innovations arise as a result of some of these challenges that the recent pandemic has presented.
Yeah.
As we reach the end of the episode, I always like to end it with a call to action. But in this case, we've given you lots of tips, tools, strategies that you can use, especially this implication diagramming. So I'd like to ask you, Bob, is there any resources or a book that you've gifted out recently that really would speak to these topics and get people more versed on implementing some of these, finding those signals in plain sight, looking upstream? Is there some resources, books that you feel would benefit those individuals?
I admit with great chagrin and my wife's disapproval that I do not have a book in print. But it's been a busy 30 some years. And as you know, I'm planning on throttling back soon. So I'll be able to get to that. Let me just give you a book that I found extremely entertaining and kind of came from out of left field. And it's Annie Duke's book called Thinking in Bets. Thinking in Bets. Annie Duke, who's I think she's now on the faculty somewhere like Stanford or something along those lines, and she's doing consulting, but she supported herself as a professional poker player for a long time. And there are many things to learn from what she looked at there. She also has a section in the book that covers one of my favorite techniques to work with clients, which is called backcasting, which is where you don't forecast and look ahead. You go out and assume, if it's a goal, assume you've gotten it. So assume you've achieved it, and then think through all the steps that it took to get there. It's extraordinarily well written. I highly recommend it. It's one of the best things I've read in the last several years. So.
Thanks for that reference. I mean, I also have recently read Super Forecasting, the Art and Science of Prediction. And that was a good book with getting good forecasting techniques. So that concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, you can subscribe through Apple or Spotify. We can also be accessed through the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, then, remember, it's not what you know, it's what you do consistently that makes the difference. Take care.